In 1908, Henry Ford stood in a cramped Detroit factory and made a promise that sounded absolutely insane. He told his engineers he was going to build a car so cheap that every working man in America could afford one. His competitors laughed. The automobile was a luxury item, a plaything for the rich. The idea that a farmer or a factory worker could own one was, frankly, ridiculous. 5 years later, nobody was laughing anymore. This is the story of Henry Ford's dominance of the early automotive industry and the competitors who tried to challenge him and failed. Before this is over, we'll see corporate sabotage, courtroom battles, ruined fortunes, and a business strategy so ruthless that it reshaped American manufacturing forever. So let's begin. But first, we need to understand what the automobile industry looked like before Ford turned it upside down. Now, in the early 1900s, cars were handmade. Each one took weeks, sometimes months, to build. Skilled craftsmen shaped metal by hand, fitted engines piece by piece, and charged accordingly. A decent automobile cost somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000. To put that in perspective, the average American worker earned about $500 a year, 8 years of wages for a car. You can see why most people just stuck with horses. And the manufacturers? They liked it that way. Building cars for the wealthy meant high profit margins on every sale. Why mass produce when you could charge a premium for exclusivity? The industry was fragmented, with dozens of small companies each producing a few hundred vehicles a year. It was more like luxury watchmaking than modern manufacturing. But Ford saw something different. He looked at those wealthy customers and saw a ceiling. He looked at the millions of working Americans and saw a floor. And he wanted the floor. The Model T arrived in 1908, and I should mention, it wasn't Ford's first car. He'd been through models A, B, C, K, N, R, and S before landing on T. Each one taught him something. Each one brought him closer to his vision. But the Model T was the breakthrough. It was simple. It was durable. And at $850, it was cheaper than anything else on the market. But Ford wasn't satisfied. $850 was still too much. Here's where we get to the assembly line, and honestly, this is where Ford's genius really shows. The idea wasn't entirely new. Slaughterhouses had been using disassembly lines for decades. Meat came in one end, cuts went out the other, with workers stationed at specific points doing specific tasks. Ford looked at that process and thought, what if we ran it backwards? What if instead of taking something apart, we put it together? In 1913, Ford's Highland Park plant introduced the moving assembly line for automobile production, and the results were staggering. Before the line, assembling a Model T chassis took about 12.5 hours. After, 93 minutes. Let that sink in for a moment. The same work reduced to 1/8 of the time, and Ford didn't stop there. He kept refining. He brought in efficiency experts who timed every movement. They studied how workers reached for tools, how they stepped between stations, how many seconds it took to tighten each bolt. If a worker had to take an extra step, Ford redesigned the station. If a tool was in the wrong place, they moved it. Every wasted motion was an enemy. The competitors watched this happening, and they didn't quite know what to make of it. See, the thing about Ford's approach was that it required an enormous upfront investment. Building a proper assembly line meant redesigning your entire factory. It meant buying new equipment, training workers differently, and committing to a production volume that would make or break you. If you built the capacity for 100,000 cars and only sold 50,000, you were ruined. Ford's rivals, mostly smaller operations with traditional manufacturing methods, simply couldn't match his scale. And here's where it gets really interesting. Ford used his growing production capacity as a weapon. Each year, as the assembly line got more efficient, Ford cut prices. In 1908, the Model T cost $850. By 1916, it was $360. By 1925, It had dropped to $260. Every price cut put more pressure on competitors. They couldn't match his costs because they couldn't match his volume. They couldn't match his volume because they couldn't invest in assembly lines. They couldn't invest in assembly lines because they didn't have Ford's sales revenue. It was a death spiral, and Ford was at the center of it, spinning faster and faster. Some tried to compete on quality. They advertised their cars as handcrafted, emphasizing the personal attention that went into each vehicle. But here's what they discovered. Most buyers didn't care. The Model T wasn't fancy, but it worked. It got farmers to market. It got salesmen to clients. It got families to church on Sunday, and it did all of that for a price that working people could actually afford. The numbers tell the story better than I ever could. In 1908, Ford produced about 10,000 vehicles. By 1914, that number had grown to 300,000. By 1920, Ford was building over 1 million Model Ts per year. At one point, half of all automobiles on American roads were Fords. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the story, because this is where Ford's competitors started getting desperate. Now I should mention that not everyone went down without a fight. Some of Ford's rivals tried different strategies, and honestly, a few of them were pretty clever. The problem was, clever wasn't enough. Take Billy Durant and General Motors. Durant was a brilliant promoter, a natural salesman who had made his fortune in horse-drawn carriages before moving into automobiles. His strategy was consolidation. He bought up car companies like a kid collecting baseball cards. Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, they all became part of General Motors. The idea was that by combining multiple brands, he could compete with Ford's scale without directly matching his production methods. But Durant had a problem. Actually, he had several problems. His collection of brands was unwieldy. Each company had its own factories, its own methods, its own bureaucracy. Coordinating them was like herding cats. And Durant himself, while brilliant at acquisition, wasn't great at operations. He'd buy a company, get distracted by the next shiny opportunity, and leave the integration to subordinates who didn't always share his vision. General Motors nearly collapsed twice during this period. Both times, banks had to step in and restructure the company. Durant was eventually pushed out of his own creation. The man who had built General Motors from nothing watched from the sidelines as professional managers took over. And while all this was happening, Ford just kept building Model Ts. He didn't care about brand variety. He didn't care about market segments. He had one car, one color, and one strategy: make it cheaper. Then there was the lawsuit. This one's fascinating because it shows just how far Ford's rivals were willing to go. In 1911, a man named George Selden held what he claimed was a patent on the automobile itself. Not on a specific design, not on a particular innovation, but on the very concept of a gasoline-powered vehicle. It sounds absurd now, but the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, a group of Ford's competitors, had bought into Selden's patent. They used it as a weapon. If you wanted to build cars legally, they argued, you needed their permission. And they weren't about to give it to Henry Ford. Ford fought back. He challenged the patent in court, arguing that Selden's design was fundamentally different from the cars actually being manufactured. The case dragged on for years. It cost Ford a fortune in legal fees. His competitors hoped it would distract him, drain his resources, maybe even shut him down entirely. They were wrong. In 1911, Ford won. The court ruled that while Selden's patent was valid, it only covered a specific type of engine that nobody was actually using. Ford was free to keep building. His competitors had spent years and millions of dollars trying to stop him through the courts, and they had nothing to show for it. But the legal challenges didn't end there. What's interesting about Ford's approach is that he didn't just defend himself. He went on offense. He hired lawyers to monitor competitors, looking for any patent infringements, any regulatory violations, anything that could be used against them. When rivals tried to poach his workers, Ford made sure they understood the consequences. He was playing to win, and he didn't particularly care about making friends. The thing is, Ford's dominance wasn't just about business tactics. It was about a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about consumption. Before Ford, most manufactured goods were either handmade luxuries or shoddy mass-produced junk. Ford offered something new, quality at scale. His cars weren't elegant, but they were reliable. They weren't fashionable, but they were affordable. He made the average person feel like a consumer, not just a laborer. And his competitors? Many of them couldn't adapt to this new reality. They were still thinking in 19th century terms, still imagining automobiles as status symbols rather than everyday tools. By the time they realized what Ford had done, it was too late. I should mention that Ford's success wasn't entirely about manufacturing efficiency. A lot of it came down to vertical integration, and honestly, this part is kind of insane. Ford didn't just build cars, he built the things that built cars. The company owned iron mines in Michigan and Minnesota. They owned forests in the Upper Peninsula for lumber. They owned rubber plantations in Brazil. They owned ships to transport raw materials, railroads to move components between facilities, and even a town, Fordlandia, carved out of the Amazon jungle to supply rubber. Think about what this meant for competitors. If you wanted to build cars the traditional way, you had to buy steel from steel companies, glass from glass companies, rubber from rubber companies. Each supplier took a profit margin. Each transaction added cost. Ford eliminated all of that. Raw materials came in one end of his system, finished automobiles came out the other, and almost every step in between was controlled by Ford himself. The River Rouge plant, which opened in 1928, was the ultimate expression of this vision. It was the largest industrial complex in the world. Iron ore and coal went in, finished cars drove out. At its peak, over 100,000 people worked there. It had its own power plant, its own steel mill, its own glass factory. It was less a factory than a small industrial nation. Competitors looked at River Rouge and saw the future. They also saw something they couldn't possibly replicate. Building that kind of integrated operation required capital on a scale that only Ford possessed. His profits from Model T sales had given him the resources to buy mines and forests and rubber plantations. Without those profits, the whole system was impossible. It was, in a very real sense, a monopoly built on efficiency. Ford hadn't cornered the market through collusion or corruption. He'd done it by being better at making things. And that made him incredibly difficult to challenge. Now, this doesn't mean Ford had no weaknesses. He did. And eventually, those weaknesses would catch up with him. But during the 19-teens and early 20s, he seemed invincible. Some competitors tried to differentiate themselves through features. Alfred Sloan, who eventually took over General Motors, pioneered the idea of annual model changes. The theory was that customers would trade in their cars for newer, more stylish versions, even if the old ones still worked perfectly. It was a fundamental challenge to Ford's philosophy of unchanging perfection. Ford's response was stubborn resistance. He kept building the Model T year after year, convinced that customers wanted function, not fashion. For a while, he was right. The Model T's simplicity made it easy to repair. Farmers could fix it with basic tools. Parts were interchangeable and widely available. Why buy something new when the old car still worked? But tastes were changing. As more Americans entered the middle class, they wanted cars that reflected their status. They wanted colors other than black. They wanted enclosed cabins and electric starters and heaters. Ford resisted. He famously insisted that customers could have any color they wanted as long as it was black. This would eventually become his downfall, but that comes later. The more immediate problem for competitors wasn't Ford's stubbornness. It was his labor strategy. In 1914, Ford did something that shocked the business world. He more than doubled his workers' wages, raising the minimum to $5 a day. At the time, factory workers earned about $2 a day. Ford's announcement made national headlines. His competitors thought he was insane. Doubling labor costs would eat into profits, raise prices, undermine everything he'd built. But Ford understood something they didn't. By paying his workers more, he accomplished several things at once. First, he reduced turnover. Assembly line work was monotonous and exhausting. Workers quit constantly, which meant constant training of replacements. At $5 a day, workers stayed. Training costs plummeted. Productivity soared. Second, he created customers. Workers who earned $5 a day could actually afford to buy Model Ts. Ford wasn't just paying for labor, he was investing in demand. Third, and this is the clever part, he put pressure on his competitors. If they wanted to attract workers, they'd have to raise their own wages. But they didn't have Ford's efficiency gains to offset the cost. Their prices would have to rise. And rising prices meant losing customers to Ford. It was brilliant, and it was ruthless. Competitors complained that Ford was destroying traditional business practices. They accused him of trying to monopolize the labor market, but workers didn't care about economic theory. They saw $5 a day and lined up by the thousands outside Ford's gates. Some rivals tried to match the wage increase. Most couldn't afford it. Those who could found themselves in the same trap as before. Higher costs meant higher prices, meant fewer sales, meant less money for investment, meant falling further behind Ford. The gap kept widening. By the early 20s, Ford's dominance was so complete that it seemed permanent. The company controlled roughly half the American automobile market. The Model T was so ubiquitous that it had become a symbol of American life, appearing in songs and stories and political speeches. Ford himself was one of the most famous men in the world, talked about as a potential presidential candidate, celebrated as a genius who had transformed modern life. And then, almost suddenly, it started to unravel. The problem was the very stubbornness that had made Ford successful. He refused to update the Model T. Year after year, competitors introduced new features, new styles, new conveniences. Year after year, Ford insisted that his customers didn't need them. The car that had been revolutionary in 1908 was starting to look antiquated by 1925. General Motors, now under Alfred Sloan's leadership, had figured out a formula. They offered cars for every budget and every taste. Entry-level Chevrolets for working families, mid-range Pontiacs, and Buicks for the upwardly mobile, luxury Cadillacs for the wealthy. Each brand had its own identity, its own customers, its own annual model updates. Sloan called it a car for every purse and purpose. Ford dismissed it as unnecessary complexity. The market disagreed. In 1927, for the first time, Chevrolet outsold Ford. The Model T, which had been the best-selling car in America for nearly 2 decades, was finally obsolete. Ford was forced to shut down production, retool his factories entirely, and introduce the Model A. The shutdown took 6 months and cost Ford millions. Thousands of workers were temporarily laid off. Dealers had nothing to sell. Competitors, smelling blood, moved aggressively into markets Ford had dominated. Ford recovered. The Model A sold well. But the era of unchallenged dominance was over. General Motors emerged as a legitimate rival, eventually surpassing Ford to become the world's largest automaker. The smaller competitors who had survived Ford's onslaught found breathing room. The industry became an oligopoly rather than a near monopoly. But that was later. During the peak years from roughly 1914 to 1926, Ford's control was absolute. The competitors who challenged him during that period, the ones who thought they could match his prices or his efficiency or his scale, were systematically crushed. Not through illegal means, not through corruption, but through relentless, grinding superiority in manufacturing. So, what happened to those challengers? And what of the smaller automakers who tried to carve out niches? Most simply vanished. The American automobile industry in 1910 had over 250 active manufacturers. By 1930, that number had fallen to around 40. By 1940, it was fewer than a dozen. Ford didn't personally destroy all of them, but he created the conditions that made survival nearly impossible. His price cuts forced everyone else to choose between matching his costs or leaving the market. Most left. And what of Billy Durant? After being pushed out of General Motors for the second time, he tried to start fresh. He founded Durant Motors in 1921, hoping to repeat his earlier success. But the industry had changed. The easy consolidation opportunities were gone. The capital requirements were enormous. Durant struggled for a decade, watching his new company slowly fail while his old one thrived. By the time of the Great Depression, Durant Motors was finished. Billy Durant, who had once been worth over $100 million, spent his final years managing a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan. He died in 1947, largely forgotten. And what of George Selden, the man who tried to claim a patent on the automobile itself? His legal defeat in 1911 ended his hopes of collecting royalties from the entire industry. He returned to Rochester, New York, and faded into obscurity. The fortune he had imagined never materialized. The technology moved forward without him. Ford himself lived until 1947. He saw his company lose its position of dominance, saw General Motors become the industry leader, saw the world he had created continue to evolve in ways he didn't always understand. In his later years, he became increasingly eccentric, dabbling in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and feuding with his own son over control of the company. The genius who had democratized the automobile became an increasingly isolated figure, stubbornly resistant to change in an industry built on change. But that doesn't diminish what he accomplished during those peak years. Between 1908 and 1926, Henry Ford didn't just build a successful company. He destroyed an entire generation of competitors through nothing more than superior execution. He proved that in industry, being the best at making things could be an unbeatable advantage. He showed that scale and efficiency, taken to their logical extremes, could create a kind of dominance that seemed almost unfair. His competitors tried everything. They tried lawsuits, they tried consolidation, they tried differentiation, they tried feature competition. Nothing worked. Ford was simply too good at what he did, and he had too much of a head start. The lessons from this era echoed through American business for decades: vertical integration, continuous cost reduction, creating customers through higher wages, using price cuts as competitive weapons. These weren't just Ford innovations. They became the template for American manufacturing supremacy in the 20th century. And for the competitors who tried to challenge him, their failures became cautionary tales. They learned, often too late, that competing with Henry Ford was like trying to outrun a locomotive. You might be faster for a while, you might even think you're winning, but the momentum was always against you, and that is the story of Henry Ford's dominance and the competitors who tried to stop him and failed. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments what you thought of Ford's approach. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.